So I will be talking about policy impacts on tropical deforestation. But I have a very particular take on that and a very particular message. So we're going to give the secondary title here. Uh-oh. Yep, there we go. Estimating the impacts of people-chosen drivers on land use and deforestation. And that's really going to be the emphasis all throughout the talk, which is the policies you see did not appear there by dartboard, right? They didn't appear there randomly. They were chosen. In fact, a few people made different kinds of choices. Agencies made choices. Landholders made choices. And they're probably not random choices. They're probably choices that might have seemed like the best choices to the agency person or the best choice to the landholder. And that perspective is going to say that the simple regression one might think of running, the simple statistical comparison, probably gets to the wrong answer. And basically I'm going to say that over and over again. With different examples, I think the reason it's worth doing is the examples are pretty well known, and I think they're usually misinterpreted. I think people look at some of the experiences that I'll be discussing, and they take away the wrong stories. And thinking about both what would people have done had there not been policies, and, so that's a people choice, right? What would the path of people's choices have been had there been no policy? And what choices led to this policy being here now? Those two people-based questions are going to lead us to think that we should do different analyses and come up with different impact evaluations. So that's it. I'm going to just say that over and over again with examples. So it's people's choices without policies, people's choices to make policies. Why does that mean you should use your numbers differently than one might do? And why do I say one might do? Because I've seen a lot of people do it in the way that doesn't acknowledge this, and I think they're often coming up with what I don't think is the best estimate. So that's the spirit of the talk. And that said, on any given one of these topics, any one of you will know much more than me, so I hope you will fill in as we go. So I should just say it's very much not just me. So a lot of people with work on Brazilian Amazon with me, economists, geographer, regional scientists, ecologists of different stripes. Same thing in Costa Rica, economists, remote sensor, ecologists. Any number of folks have made any one of the things that I put up there go. I'm not going to assign slide-by-slide responsibility, but it's a big group over time in each of these areas that I've worked. It's now expanding to work in Mexico, Guatemala. Two students here in the last year who finished at the Nicholas School with a PhD and a master's, working in the Mayan forest in an interoceanic highway in Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil. So taking these same ideas and taking them out to other areas includes some of their own colleagues. And I'm working with Lucas on some related work as well. That's probably how you got stuck. So let me give background. So one thing I want to be careful about is sometimes when an economist makes a presentation from an economic point of view, people seem to think that that means they think that's the only thing that matters. So I definitely don't think that. That little speech I just gave, I think matters. But a lot of other people work on forests with other perspectives. So let me do a very crude summary. So a lot of analyses of policies focus on particular features of ecosystems. Probably a lot of people in this room think about particular features of ecosystems. So where are ecosystem services provided? Where is habitat affected? What are the details of how carbon is stored or released in different carbon or nitrogen-rich environments? Right? So things that I don't know that well, but I perfectly understand why people would study them. So Dave Schimmel, working closely with me on Costa Rica, other ecologists there, those are some of their foci as well. Is that the only thing we need to think about for policy? I'll say no. But is that an important feature for thinking about policy? Yes, of course it is. So valued features of ecosystems, things you will all know more than me, I think really matter, but they're not my focus today. What about some analysts, perhaps more social scientists, but not always, some applied ecologists in the field, get to know certain groups. They tend to focus on valued groups of people, right? So this indigenous group, or that poor group, or these people who had rights, or me, because I should value myself, so I'll argue for my own forest outcome, right? So there's infinite numbers of breakdowns of people, and the big fight is sometimes about I get it, or you get it, or who gets the benefits, or who incurs the costs. So that really matters too. That'll be in the background some here. But it's also not my focus. My focus is going to be this analytical point about how do you put data together and thinking about policy impacts. But it obviously matters, right? Tons of policy debate is really about me versus you, him versus her, them versus them, etc. Okay, so given those things, which obviously matter, here's my point. So you want to take into account why is the forest being cleared, what choice is being made, by whom, and thus building into that model of why is it being cleared, what's a reasonable guess about what impact a policy will have. Somehow that doesn't always end up in a policy debate. What policy are you actually thinking about? Whose decision will you impact? What decisions would they have made otherwise? And thus, what is the actual impact? Right? There are plenty of discussions of forest policy that don't have that. Or have a version that perhaps is incomplete. Everything is incomplete. So what I'm going to be doing is thinking about that background story. Sort of simple, very commonsensical, I would say, efforts to predict deforestation rates without policies, and then thinking about which people are making which decisions, and then think about, well, what will happen if you do have policies. So I think this kind of thinking is relevant for lots of stuff. The location of a road, the location of a forest reserve, the allocation of a payment for carbon services, as in the Kyoto Protocol, or a carbon market if that is coming. Thinking about poverty alleviation investments that might affect forests. So this basic idea of which decisions would be made, how will policies change them, I think matter for a ton of different policies. I'll talk about a few of them. But that's the big overview. So what are some of the questions that one might think about? In the Amazon, what really got me into this deforestation long ago was people claiming, more or less in the Egypt conference, the Cairo Conference on Population in 1994, things coming out that sounded like, geez, it's just all those, there's so many poor people running around, they're just ruining everything. And I'm not commenting on population policy here, right? There's lots to say about population policy. But I thought, it's not obvious to me that you can't have plenty of deforestation with just a few people. So I'm not sure this is just a population problem. And start to think about that. Then there's a claim out there, this is going to motivate some of the work I'll mention later. There's a book out there and some papers since then, I've seen citations to it, in which people say, geez, do new roads lower deforestation rates? I had a discussion once today in which people thought, why study roads? We all kind of know that it has that impact. I think a lot of people think that. I'm going to try to say there was a reason for people to have done the analysis that led to the claim that new roads lower deforestation rates, the reason why I think it's wrong, and then there's a reason that it motivates something like Dahlia Moore's PhD thesis in the Nicholas School on the Mayan forest and specific details of what do roads do in which settings, and how could that have led to the mistake, I believe, of claiming that roads lower deforestation rates, even when the analysts were being honest and trying to answer with the data. How are the roads located? Who chooses that? And so what? We'll talk about that. Costa Rica. Now, Costa Rica was out there early in the carbon discussion, wanting to get payments for saving the forest, right? Always you want to know, no one's going to pay Costa Rica for every tree, right? You pay for more than you would have done, right? I will pay you in red, carbon markets, post-Bali. I'll pay you for more forest than you would have had. What's the problem with that policy or that contract? You will never, ever see what you would have had, right? That's an unobservable counterfactual. So you're going to have to guess what you would have had and compare that to what you have and make a payment. That's actually not trivial, right? So you want to think about some form of deforestation or carbon baseline. Right? Deforestation is just tree fall down. Carbon includes all the carbon work in this room on varying carbon densities over space, depending on various ecological parameters, right? So you want to combine those, integrate it. And then everyone would love a win-win. Who doesn't love a win-win? So could we maybe just pay the poor folks, and that would help the poor and help the forest? So there's actually shockingly little empirical analysis of what actually happens in a range of settings, and what do you mean by poverty, and which way of getting money to them. These are things that matter for policy. Are there spatial interactions? So there's spatial dynamics. So if you affect clearing in one place, does it spill over to another? This is pretty important for thinking about planning, and almost no empirical analysis there either. And here's something I'll be focusing on a fair bit today. So now you've got all this background stuff, which I'm going to insist is really important. But you have a lot of focus these days on, geez, if someone were to pay me to keep forests up for carbon reasons, and of course a lot of other people say, don't just worry about carbon, worry about all the other stuff, large debate. But if someone were going to pay me for the carbon part, whatever else happens, what might I do? Well, a lot of people will probably create new forest reserves. Baseline, I will claim that most of the forest reserve impact claims are far overstated. Most forest reserves haven't saved as much forest as people will tend to say they have saved. Why? The basic story, because the place someone chose where to put those reserves, they're not in the randomly allocated place that people have been by default assuming, and the implication is going to be, and I'll try and argue why, the impact of the reserve is lower than you thought. So what? Who cares? Well, what if Costa Rica is facing the question, I could earn money by changing forest relative to a baseline? Do they want to just assume that every forest in a park was saved? Because now it's being measured, right? There's going to be measurements of your forest. You can't just assume it. We're going to be paid if the forest really is higher than baseline. Or does Costa Rica want to know, in some conditions, the park has a higher impact on deforestation, and in some, it has lower? I would argue you want to know that. You want to know where the impact is higher. You want to know if you're going to spend $10, are you going to have $10 of impact? 5, 2, 1, less than 1? I'm going to argue that Costa Rican ecosystem service payments, is the most famous ecosystem service payments in the world, probably are having impact at the moment on deforestation rates of something like 1 in 100. That's very low. Pay 100 people, change one decision. So I might be wrong, but if I'm anywhere close to right, Costa Rica probably wants to know, I wonder what I want to do in allocating my resources to earn global carbon payments. Okay. So how would I know this? I'd have to know these background things and then layer the policy on top of it. So what choices do people make without policies? What impacts do the policies have? So punchline, results. Not sure about the order of this. Let me go here. Let me skip register. I don't know how the time's going to go. I'm going to focus on these parks and payments results. I have a bunch of stuff on roads at the back and the Brazilian Amazon. If we get to it, we do it. If we don't, we don't. Okay, so I've been saying decisions, decisions, decisions. What is that literally going to make me do differently in terms of the statistics? So tons of policy discussion in the world. There's infinite documents on forest policy. There's much less attention, in my view, to where policy. Like where is the policy located and why? In particular, agencies make decisions, as I said. Let's think of parks for a moment. Pretty much an agency decision, right? Or top-down, put a reserve here, could be an NGO, put a reserve there, but top-down. So someone decides where I'm going to draw the line. What about landowner choices? Why are those in there? Landowners don't choose where parks go. No, but they have chosen where ecosystem service payments go. Why? Because in Costa Rica, you had to volunteer your land to potentially be in the ecosystem service payment program. You had to show up and say, yes, I have forest now. I would like to keep it in forest. If I end up with forest at the end of the payment period, I'll get this money, right? Or if I keep it year by year, I'll get annual payments. That was a decision by the landowner to come and volunteer. Do you think they are volunteering randomly? They just say, I don't know, I got 10 parcels, how about this one? No, probably not, right? They're probably thinking, which ones are best for agriculture? Which ones I really probably won't get that much out of for agriculture anyway? Why don't I just walk in there and see if I can get a carbon payment, right? That's probably an optimizing decision, right? That's what I would do if I were a landowner, probably what you would do too. And there's implications of that for what you think the impact of the payments will be. So we're going to look over space. Where are the parks? Where are the payments? Boy, it really looks non-random. Right? It doesn't look like these policies were just allocated over space on the dartboard. It really looks like they were chosen along certain dimensions. Further, it really makes a difference in the estimates of the impacts. Specifically, 3 results for Costa Rica. Payments for ecosystem services. First, you have to say this, but it turns out to be less relevant for the rest of the world. The impact, as I said, is looking like 1 in 100. Very low impact. Is this a critique of Costa Rican policy? No, it's the opposite. Costa Ricans have done so many other things to stop deforestation. By the time you throw on a payments program in '97, at the same time as you throw in a ban or restriction on various land uses, it's not too shocking that the 6th thing you do doesn't necessarily have that big an impact when you've done 5 other things, right? So I think there's actually a much more complicated story about why there could be an impact. But when people look at Costa Rica and say, geez, they did payments, and their deforestation rate is low, thus, if I do payments, mine will be big mistake, right? That is not defended by the data, right? There are plenty of things to learn. What I think we should thank Costa Rica for is going out there in front so we can learn lessons from how these things work. And the matching gets to the second part of that. What we learned is that a volunteer-in policy is going to bias you towards low impact, as I just mentioned. The matching, what I'm going to do in matching, what matching is going to be is comparing apples to apples. So I'm going to say, you know what, I have reason to believe, and I just checked, that the payments are in a non-random set of places. Thus, it is not the right comparison to say deforestation in payments, deforestation out of payments. Why? because those aren't similar kinds of places. So what do? Really simple. Take the payments places, find the most similar places, and I'll tell you what that means, among all the others, and compare deforestation in the most similar places to the payments places. Compare apples to apples. Very different result. Okay? Not so very different in percentages for payments, but not in absolutes, because there's basically no impact anyway. So nothing and nothing is pretty close to nothing, and they're close to each other. But you will see that you're actually going to divide by 3 the impact. So you're getting a third the impact you think. Who cares, right? Because a third of nothing is nothing. But the policy design point holds, right? That if the bias by choice is dividing impact by 3, you probably want to know that, right? Maybe not in Costa Rica special case, but you want to know that in other places. Okay, parks within their own boundaries, right? So within the park boundary, what happened? First, real important, remember that background deforestation story, right? You got to know what's going on in the background. So look at Costa Rica, a really nice comparison. We had one paper that's just accepted in PNAS, looking from 63 forward. By the way, there was clearing from 63 forward in Costa Rica. There was action going on. It's one of the reasons you had all those parks. Those parks actually do prevent some deforestation, because there was some deforestation to present. And you can actually pretty easily see that when you go from 86 forward, which is the second paper, there's much less deforestation to present. From 97 forward, when the payment started, almost none. Net reforestation in 2000, 2005. So the parks do some stuff because there was some stuff to block, right? But how much do they do? Correcting for the non-random allocation cuts the impact by a factor of 4 now. You're achieving a quarter the deforestation prevention that you thought you were. You want to know that. The second paper says, sort of moving towards, you don't want to just be critiquing, right? That's not the point. The point is to move forward constructively. I think you want to know if you're only doing 1 in 4 when you thought you were doing 1 in 1. To be honest, if I tell someone who's really passionate about conservation that you're getting 1/4 of the benefits, I actually would expect the answer, well, so what? 1/4 of really high is still really high, right? But here's a different perspective. You have finite resources. What if I told you over here you can get 8 out of 10 impact and over there 2 out of 10 impact? You might go for the 8 out of 10, right? And everyone knows there's finite resources for conservation. So the second paper more focuses on here and there you have different ratios of impact. And you can really easy choices, really easy ones. Okay. Everything is harder than what I'm saying, but these first order points still hold. Okay. Now let's talk about parks outside their boundaries, right? The famous leakage or spillover. Everyone talks about it, almost no empirical results on it. So this is the newest stuff for us. So I'm going to show you something, and then I'm going to tell you that we've done more results that aren't in PowerPoint yet. But first, if anything, we find leakage. By the way, you could find the opposite. There are stories out there, honest stories, theoretical, honest observational stories, theoretical stories for why you could go the other way. You could do a park and inspire more forest around it. Different reasons: economic stories, preferences stories, information stories, expectation stories. You could tell those stories. And indeed, Juan Oblea and I, we find that private deforestation behavior spills over to cause private deforestation behavior. Which is to say, private conservation seems to spill over to provide private conservation. But for parks, a very different action from an individual landowner in a particular place. A big giant thing pushed down by the government. If anything, we find leakage. Conservation here leads to deforestation around it. By the way, this is spatially, this is right next door leakage. Leakage could, of course, occur much more broadly. There are people who have shown, for instance, that linkages through timber markets find that if you don't clear here, you can get clearing on the other side of the world because the price responds, right? So you can have very distant leakage, right? But this is immediate spatial proximity leakage that I'm talking about here. Okay, so the other thing is that correcting for non-randomness actually gets rid of something that you look at and you think it's just bizarre. Why would that happen? It reverses a very counterintuitive spatial pattern. But you have no reason to have done that. You would have looked at that and said, why is this true? And then I'll show you by doing apples to apples makes it much more sensible. So that's kind of what I'll show you. If we get done with that, I'll tell you more about Brazilian roads, Mayan roads, Peruvian interoceanic roads. I just give you the punchline for why roads also. Just think of this in the context of red policy and carbon payments. It may be that most of what countries do is, if they want to earn carbon payments, put in more parks, do some ecosystem services payments. Very sensible. But there is nothing stopping you from also just changing the way you do your development, right? The clean development mechanism doesn't say just do parks. It could say develop cleanly. So what might that be? The kind of evidence I'm trying to develop now is that a road here and a road there aren't necessarily doing the same thing. Right? So one spatial pattern of roads, and another spatial pattern of roads, even if they accomplish the same development objectives, they could have different deforestation implications. That's not a conservation policy, right? That's a shift in a development plan, and that could swamp, by the way, could swamp conservation policies in magnitude, depending on what you're talking about, right? Exchange rates and trade policies also could swamp it, right? So there's a lot of other behavior in the world that might have more impact in principle on forests than conservation and payments, which are focused on conservation. So I want to stress that we should also be thinking about evaluating the impacts on forest of shifts in your development path, like a movement in the road network, and that's what motivates that other work. I don't know if we'll get to say any more than that today. Okay, so we got to have background empirical work. So we're using 63, 79, 86, 97, 2000, 2005 aerial photo and satellite data. This work initially started with district and sub-district observations. Just make a small comment there. What you can do at the Nicholas School with very skilled students who are really good with these gigantic monitors, which, you know, in GIS, which I can't even do anything with, is amazing, right? And it's also not universal. Right? Data sets are not all that good, and the ability to handle them or not is not always that widespread. It certainly is disseminating, which is a wonderful thing, including as students from here go back to wherever they started. But that said, it's important in my mind to think about trade-offs between analytical complexity and the results that you get. Like if you can get the basic results with simpler data, that's important to know, right? You don't always want to be only showing what you can do with maxed out data and technique. So, you know, find whether you can find the results in simple data and simple results. It may be more disseminatable as an analytical technique. So I think that's an important issue. Another issue is just transparency, right? In terms of treaties, the whole simple versus black box complicated that people think other people know and are manipulating, right? That really matters in negotiations. Transparency, even sometimes at the cost of accuracy, could potentially be worthwhile. I don't want to get into that, but I just raise it quickly here. Okay, so we do these regressions. The stuff that you would expect matters. You can't measure everything, of course, but you measure some things that you would think matter. Like, you know, think of Costa Rica has this wonderful property of these tremendously different biophysical zones within a small country. You know, call them the Hodger's life zones, call them whatever you want. But there's a lot of variation, right? So coffee grows here, doesn't grow there. That matters a lot, right? Cattle tend to be here, they're not there. So it matters a lot for variation over space and the attractiveness of clearing, which helps us to estimate this kind of thing. So rain, temperatures, soil, slopes are a big deal. They have the effects that you would think. So you sort of have a biophysical, biogeography of deforestation story. And then things like distances to roads and markets show up the way you would think. This is the basic story. Before I get to more, you know, sophisticated twists on roads, you know, being near roads, being near markets makes a difference. Background deforestation, you can run these regressions and they have some sense and some predictive power. So that's in the background. Why does it matter? Because it also offers us a bunch of characteristics of places that matter. So when I say that parks are distributed non-randomly, these are the dimensions I'm going to use. I'm saying that you will tend to see the parks in places with higher slopes, further from markets, further from roads, all the things that are less good for clearing. That's what I mean. And you can measure more things, which would be wonderful. I'd be delighted to measure more things. But the ones I have, I think, will make this point. Okay? So these things matter, and I'm going to tell you these are the dimensions that I'm going to show you non-randomness of allocation of policies. Okay? So what do you get? This is sort of the integrated thing for 1 second. You can get these projections of deforestation. This is from our old Costa Rica work. You would clearly want to link to ecological work about carbon density over space. So, you know, you got temperature, precipitation, variation, determining MPP. You have soils and human disturbances. Anyway, you know, we had an NC group, a bunch of ecologists. I do a bad job paraphrasing what they say. But we were trying to link the models. You know, mine is what knocks down trees. Theirs is what's the carbon implication of a knockdown tree, right? So 2 models, easy to put together. You want both. Again, we had this simple complex thing going on. So you've got your process-based model where, you know, you've got a bunch of inputs, you're pulling some parameters, God knows where, you know, same thing with economic models, right? Off the shelf from some book somewhere, then you get some parameters from very intense field work, you know, nitrogen goes to the leaf or the stem or whatever, right? And, you know, there's a whole lot going in these models. There's a real payoff from that, right? Because what you get out can be overtime pads of carbon, not just climax. You can simulate regimes that you've never observed in the real world, like you're going to no-tilling something. Even if you've never seen it, you can make it up what it means in this parameter space. Very nice. On the other hand, pretty costly in terms of the ability to run it and all the data you need. And then you've got your sort of life zone model where do a map, precipitation, biotemperature, boom, prediction of climax vegetation, right? Ultimately simple, much more complex. What's the right combination of expenditures on the complexity of ecological modeling? Same questions in economic. Just to raise it, so you all face those questions. And it would come up. So let's go to ecosystem.
Can I just ask, your deforestation data itself, is for Costa Rica, for example, some wall-to-wall analysis of landscape at specific periods in time.
Yes.
And you assume something between years, or you're doing some integrated thing over?
So you're not assuming any particular time path over the years. You're saying specifically this. And then you even say there's net deforestation, and there's two pieces of that, deforestation and reforestation. So what I look at in my regressions is, if this let's take the pixel statement first. If this pixels in forest at time 1, does it stay in forest or become deforested by time 2? That's the outcome. And the probability of that outcome occurring as a function of these variables. So it doesn't say anything about where in the period it would occur. Just literally the probability of change or no change across the period. And only for the places that start in forest. So I'm not doing the net. That matters when you start to look at times like 2000. So 97 to 2000, I think there's net deforestation. 2000, 2005, there's net reforestation, but the deforestation is higher in that period than it was in the prior period, even though there's more reforestation to cover. Why does that matter? Because I actually gave the payments more to do 2000, 2005, because there's more to block. So I'm looking at the deforestation transition, was in forest, stage or not.
And what's your sense of the accuracy of that deforestation satellite product over time?
Yeah, so I would say my sense is limited in the sense of my general intelligence about remote sensing products. So for instance, I'll give you an example. In the work that I'm doing with someone now, I'm quite comfortable saying I'm not worried about losing some of the resolution that's claimed in the data by going to 3 by 3, so we're merging 9 pixels, because I think my point is going to be easily made with the higher one, and I'm not as worried about the minimum mapping unit and whether it's exactly right. So those are very important discussions. I don't think they're influencing anything that I'm telling you, but I do understand why, for some questions and in certain fields, you want to get very focused on that. And let me just raise one issue, right, in case no one does. People tend to in these kind of audiences. I'm doing deforestation. What about degradation, right? Red, reduced emissions deforestation. I'm not doing degradation, right? Because the satellite that I'm getting is not telling me degradation. And we know it's out there and it can matter. So there's something that I don't have, which is an important thing to acknowledge. Payments. So Costa Rica has been a leader. Right, 97, these payments started. This is one of my websites, very, very widely cited. I mean, I would say if you find this is not true, please email me. I would say that you look around the world and everyone says, look what those payments did, other people should do that. Now, as an environmental economist, every textbook I have says it's a really good idea to make a payment to have the landowner internalize the social value of staying in forests. There, I'm totally on board. Except for I think that implementation details matter. So what is that, is the question, right? So what exactly do they do? In particular, there are 3 kinds of contracts. The big one is, it's in the forest, keep it that way. That's where most of the money goes. That's the one I'm going to study. That's the one that the carbon payments would be like. Right? The red payment is, keep it in forest, don't let it deforest. Right? They did have payments for reforestation. They did have some payments for forest management. That's not what I'm studying. I'm looking here at the big one, the dominant one, and the red payment analogous one. Okay? So, what do you say? Let me tell you, even if people won't admit it, every presentation I have seen, sneakily or explicitly, I could pull up a talk at the Bonnie Fuller World Wildlife Fund Symposium 2 years ago, where it just says, these things stopped deforestation. We have statistics to prove it. Turned out the number of observations was 19, which is tough for a regression, but anyway, the claim was very clear, right? So one way or another, people are saying, did payments, no deforestation, thus payments stop deforestation. Okay. you just can't avoid it. And again, if you don't find that to be true, I would love to hear, but I think that's what people are saying. And I think there's a hell of a lot to learn, but we want to learn the right lesson. So could other things have affected deforestation? Yes. How about those parks that we're going to study? Tons of parks. Out there, well-known park system, I think it mattered, as we'll discuss. Ecotourism, very big. People tend to forget private market incentives. You tend not to hear people discuss a crash in the beef market. And let me tell you, that definitely mattered for Guanacaste with the cattle out of the tropical dry forest. At least, I think it did. Various prices. In the 60s, when deforestation started going up in Costa Rica, it was when they opened the economy to all sorts of exports, like coffee, beef, right? It was prices, it was trade. Soy prices, timber prices, these things are still out there today. Exchange rates really matter. So let's not forget those. Perhaps most important of all, at the very point of the payments, in 1997, there's a restriction put up that's a barrier on additional clearing. So now you basically said, we're going to make it really hard for you to clear, and then we'll give you some money if you don't clear. But if you've already enforced this ban, right, it's just hard to think that the literal spatial allocation of the payments is making much difference. Okay, that's true, and the only thing that matters is not to say that there was a failure to have a smart policy. It's a really good policy. The question is, let's focus on the details and what works and what doesn't. So I'll tell you a story, by the way, of a possible impact. Totally different from what you read in the literature. I think the following is probably true. And this is actually including talking to people who were Minister of Environment in Costa Rica, two of them over time. I imagine, by the way, it was the same act when this restriction was passed and the payments were passed. This restriction is somewhat like what in the US you would call it takings, right? A legal passing of the right to do what you want with your land. I think it may be true that the way you get that takings through is by promising to do compensation in the form of some kind of payments program. So it is very reasonable to think that the payments did have some impact by raising the feasibility of a takings-like policy. Okay, if people around the world had said that, I'd say great. But that means that all the details of where the payments went had nothing to do with the impact, right? So you can't be learning how to do the details if what it really did was allow a political trade so that a ban could be enforced. Second, how many countries do you know where you can pass this ban? Right? So the exportability of this is quite different if it's make a deal on a ban, because you can pull off a ban, versus, oh, just do a payment and everything will work, right? So the sort of practical replication is quite different, the implications. So I think, you want to learn what you can learn and what you should learn. And I think that's an important story, right? Because there are things about compensation for takings in the world that matter, but they're not quite the same as just pay and it'll be fine. Okay? So how do we do this? We do pixels, 10,000 points across Costa Rica, as I was just saying to Prasad. There's the dependent variable, as I mentioned. I'm going to use 8697 only to forecast deforestation from 97 to 2000. Payments started in 97. Controlling for those things, as I mentioned, we need these other characteristics that matter, right? Cities, roads, rivers, schools, rain, elevation, slope. We'll be controlling for those and then using them to do the apple-to-apple match. So just big picture, there's no clearing going on. So there's 60 points that are in the program PSA, Pagos Servicios Ambientales. None of them are cleared. Enforcement is good. That is not shocking. Costa Rica is definitely on top of that. What about outside? 1,699 points uncleared, 11 cleared, 1/5 of 1% of the non-policy places are cleared. So that's got to tell you something. I mean, how much can you prevent when there's 1/5 of 1% going on the outside? I'm about to tell you that you probably prevented 1/3 of that number, or like 8%, 8 out of 100. But, basically there's not a lot of clearing going on. So, hard to say there's an impact. Now, that's not necessarily right, though, right? Because it's a very well-informed agency in Costa Rica. FONAFIFO knows a lot. Small country, you can get everywhere, too. So, what I just said was that average outside the policy deforestation kind of tells you it can't be preventing that much. I think that's true. But this could be a very knowledgeable agency. They could be going specifically to hotspots where there was going to be clearing using good local knowledge, right? Now think of the Federal Reserve in the U.S., right? They use macro models. They got a ton of econ PhDs in like the big pyramid leading up to the chairman. But mostly, they got their fingers on the economy, right? They are measuring their heads off, right? Watching things move as much as they can. It's really real-time, adaptive information, and respond. Well, foreign people knows a lot, too. Maybe they're watching deforestation pressures come up, and they're targeting them with a really good target. So the average story, 1/5 of 1%, maybe that's not right. Maybe they're almost always having impact. That is a reasonable story. What about the other story, though? What if people volunteering is the dominant story? What if basically everybody who walks up and says, yeah, I'm in forest, and I'll stay in forest, pay me? What if they were all going to be in forest anyway? Right? What if they didn't change any decision at all? They were going to keep their land in forest, and when someone said, we'll pay you to stay in forest, they said, sure, I'll pay money. I was going to leave in forest anyway. Money sounds good. Right? Then the impact of the program is zero. Right? So, two different decisions going on. Agency-informed decision, landowner-informed decision. Who wins? Landowner wins. So, predicted deforestation rates, they're all very low. Right? They're all under 1% per year. Most of the observations are in very, very low predicted deforestation. So in this group, 4% of the observations are in the program. And then as we move to the left, there's higher predicted deforestation rates from my other regression. If the agency is targeting high threats, the fraction of the later column should be above 4%. If people are only bringing in really crappy land to the agency, then the fraction to the left should be lower than 4%. Well, I don't want to point too far out there, but as we move here 3 and here 1, this is not a proof yet. This is our first cut saying, looks like the bias is towards low pressure land is in the program. So if you thought 1/5 of 1% was the impact, and that was low, it's lower than that. That was an upper bound. This doesn't matter so much when you're at 0. It matters a lot when we get to parks in a moment. Okay, so given how long I'm taking to say things I'm saying, I'm not going to go through the details of action, but I just want to stress this. So what am I going to do? I'm going to say I just saw a suggestion that the payments are on a sort of crappy land subset. So I want to match other places with high slopes, far from markets and distances, and compare. So I want to compare the treated or the policy to similar. So what is similar? Okay. Who knows what similar is, right? You make up your own definition of similar, and we can run that. Two are pretty dominant in the literature that I'm drawing on. One is pretty straightforward, covariant matching. You just take, say, slope, and you take distance, and you find the places with the closest slopes, the closest distance. In fact, you're doing a n-dimensional match, distance in x space, right? So you want to find the points that are least distant in x space from the policy points. So closest in the combination of slope, distance to road, So you're just getting the most similar characteristic places. This one actually says, I'm going to run a probability, I'm going to predict who ends up in the program. And I'm going to match to the places that are most likely, closest to the payment in being likely to be in the program. Let me just concretize that. There's a park in Costa Rica which has such bad characteristics that its probability of being made a park is very, very high. And I can't find any place else in the country that has a really good match. By the way, I'm going to have to drop that when I say I'm comparing apples to apples. But then I go to other parks and I say, this place is high slope, whatever, whatever, and that predicts it's pretty likely to be in a park. Now I'm going to take all the other places and find their likelihoods of being in a park, and I'm going to match our likelihood of being in a park. I'm not going to try to prove to you now that that's sensible, but people have proved that either matching seems to get you a reasonable, consistent estimator. Obviously, to me, there is no truth for the definition of similar. Run them both, see what you're getting, so that's what we do. And there's a lot of other choices you can make, and we don't have time to go through them. So, what do you find? This is the punchline. You have to choose how many points outside the treatment you're going to draw. I'll draw one outside point for every policy point, or 2, or 3, or 10, or 50. What's the trade-off? As I draw more, I have more statistical power. On the other hand, as I draw more comparison points, I'm getting the less similar. The apples are getting a little less appley, right? So there's a trade-off on sort of how many points I use to compare and the quality of the match. Okay. So I do a whole range. Why not? And roughly we're getting 0.08% impact. Who cares about that? Except for that, it's like less than half of what the estimate was before. So the fact that a non-random set of points is being volunteered in implies that less than half and close to a third of what you thought was the impact before is the real estimate. That point is incredibly relevant for carbon payments if a carbon market comes. Right? The dropping, the cutting by 2, cutting by 3, the impact really is relevant for payments design around the world. And that is not the lesson that most people talk about for this program. I don't know if I'm going to get to it. Let me see if I have it. I don't remember. I'm just too tired these days. Yeah, I may go back to those, but we talked about like 205.
Yeah.
Stop it. Okay, so I'm not going to go through that method. What that method was, I'll just show this one picture, is I try to do apples to apples. Sometimes I can't. These are points where I couldn't find other good apples. So when I do a robustness check, I drop these, and I only do the comparison here. It didn't make a difference. But if I'm going to say I'm doing apples to apples, I got to check that I got it, right? So there's a lot of checking that you got similarity. And there's a non-similar. That's what that picture is. Okay, so 2 things. One, let's not get into the politics of it, but there's still people who are arguing that there's a big impact. It's just not true. But that doesn't mean there aren't good lessons, right? So here's a good lesson. Post-2000, we have another analysis, another paper for 2000 2005. That was 97 to 2000. Sorry, I didn't say that. After 2000, the World Bank remade the loan Ecomercados. There were some conditions on doing more targeting. But what is targeting? Targeting turns out to mean different things to different people. Targeting to me means find places that we're going to clear, pay them so they don't. Make a difference in the land use. But targeting to some of the people in this room, quite reasonably, going back to my first slide, might mean go for places that have really good birds, right? Or really good ecosystem services. That would be eminently sensible. That would make sense because what that does is that raises the services value if you change the land use, right? And what I'm saying is whatever the services value is, if you actually change the land use instead of doing nothing, you'll raise the impact. They're both true, right? They're both reasonable. But, so we had an interesting accident is what I think has happened here. And there's a positive lesson. This is the lesson. Changing the details of implementation can change impact. So you're not constrained to getting a low impact. You're not constrained to bad targeting. You can change it. Change your targeting. They didn't do this on purpose, but I think we get a lesson by mistake. So there was targeting that, if anything, I think was targeted more on the ecological side. So less influence of landowner volunteering. Because more top-down, we want it here, we want it there, we want to say this, we want to say that. What might happen if you take out the influence of landowner volunteering? You might get rid of that bias, right? They weren't aiming for high-pressure places. But if you aim for ecologically good places, and those are uncorrelated with threat, whereas the volunteering was very clearly correlated with no threat, you could wipe out the bias that cut the thing from 0.21 to 0.08. That's roughly what happened. Post-2000, that bias isn't there anymore. Just by eliminating the landowner decision power in the enrollment, you actually make a difference in the impact you have. And you can only still have so much impact, right? There wasn't a lot of clearing. But that's not the story. The story is, given the background, how much can you do with the policy? And the details of implementation matter. So there's a positive spin, which I'm going to give you in parks also, which is understanding that targeting one way gets you low impact, opens the door to target another way, once you think about it, to raise the impact. So that was true here. I think it's relevant for carbon. I'll do parks, and then I think we probably should stop. Protected areas, stop. More general term. So lots of protected areas in Costa Rica, various expansions. There are certainly decisions on new reserves pending, just like people are talking about new big road. They're also talking about Mesoamerican biological corridor, all sorts of stuff. But there will be more reserves. There was a GRUOS proposal. There was even a story about trying to cover different ecosystems. Again, there would be ecosystem type of targeting within the Mesoamerican proposal. Anyway, more will happen. There is this literature, a lot of it is sort of applied conservation about best places to put reserves. I'm sure many of you know it much better than me. For me, I'll summarize it in a very particular way. It was all about where are the species, right? It's all ecological targeting. And there's different ways to do it, scoring, iterative programming. You get more fancy about not doing redundant species saving, which is smart. some acknowledgement of uncertainty, but it's not the kind of uncertainty that I'm talking about, which is the probability that your forest just goes away by next period, right? The threat. The uncertainty here is, especially I can tell, some of the species data is estimated species, not actual species, right? You estimate the probability of a species off of a few sightings, etc. So you're saving estimated species, okay, fine. But then finally we got around to land costs. So there are some folks who've thrown in costs. Interestingly, so Dick Rice at, gosh, where is he? CI? Somebody help me? No? Okay, I think he is. Recent big conservation meeting. Is very focused on low-priced land now. It's interesting because it goes the opposite direction of what I'm talking about. Very low-priced land is probably not so good for clearing and probably not that likely to get cleared. Right? So there's a real tension between what I'm telling you and the price of the land you might have to pay. I believe that that's going to be a major practical conflict in conservation choices as we go forward. Especially if you want to get a conservation payment. I heard that the other day by someone who's trying to sell a project for carbon credits. Okay, so what I'm focused on is the chance that land goes away. Oops. And whether this thing will grow. I'm focused on that too. I will talk. Let's see what happens. Okay, so what do I tell you? So punchline, there's a picture up there that we suggest says, you can see the Gruas corridors. Is it going? Yes, perfect. Can you go to that one? Just go. Thank you. Here you go. Hang on. Okay, good. The Gruas corridors were proposed based on what? Well, pretty darn obviously applied ecology. Why? They're corridors. Corridor as in connect, right? So this is clearly one of these effective meta-habitat ideas, right? You get more habitat if things are connected and it's larger. Could be very sensible. I don't know how much species data there is behind proving effective meta-habitat, but it doesn't matter. Could be a good idea. That's what happened. So what I say, well, you might want to think about this, the combination of that with threat. Blue areas are higher threat, more likely to get cleared. Yellow areas are Gruas, what's green, blue, and yellow. So once you've established your ecological areas, it's possible you want to target threat within them. Okay, so that was a something 2004 paper. What's the punchline, though? I'm advocating non-randomness, right? Non-randomness is smart. It's just that it matters for doing statistics later on what are the actual impacts. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to stop in just a second. I will jump. We've got to do this matching again, and here's the story. So this is 86 to 97. I'll stop with these results. If you say deforestation rate in the parks, basically zero. Deforestation rate outside the parks, basically 10% clearing over the decade, roughly, right? So it's basically decade, basically 10%, a percent a year. Okay. What if, there's two steps. One is the simple step and one is the matching I was telling you. What is, first, just run a regression that controls for other characteristics. Put in your regression all those things I told you about. Even then, you cut down to 2%. What does that mean? Controlling for the fact that the places the parks are worse for clearing, you lower your impact to 2% in a decade. 2%, 10%, that's a pretty big difference, right? In the PNAS paper, which is from 63 forward, we get, as I told you, is divided by a factor of 4 or more, right? So we say that would be 2.5 versus 10, right? So roughly we're saying maybe 3/4 of what you thought was saved forest probably actually wasn't saved when you take the baseline into consideration. And in particular, why do you get it wrong? Because you looked at all other places in the country, not, as I'm going to do here, these two lines, the places in the country that are similar to the parks, the places that are in the protected areas. And you can run it in a bunch of different things. Of course, every time you do a different definition of similarity, you'll get a different number. But then, if anything significant is in the 1 or 2% range, similar to this, I can tell you, a bunch of stories over and over about what we'll find repeatedly in the parks of Costa Rica. And we're now starting work in Mexico. Our preliminary results look a lot like this. It's actually cutting by 2 there, not by 4. We're going to apply the Mayan stuff to parks in the Mayan area. And Lucas is working on work like this. Roughly controlling for where people actually put policies. Whether it's an agency decision or a landowner decision, you tend to see, as an empirical matter, first of all, you should take it into account. As an empirical matter, it seems to be saying policies are in less clear clearing threatened places. The impacts of the policies are lower than you think. Why does it matter? If you think about how you're going to spend domestic money to earn global carbon payments, you want to think about where are you going to have impact that really moves deforestation relative to baseline. So we think for design of ecosystem service payments, for design of policies like protected areas that might earn global carbon payments, you want to take this into account. Indeed combined, as I said, with a lot of the ecological perspectives and the social perspectives, etc. And I should stop just because I'm